In this lesson, we will be contrasting the unbiblical and heretical philosophy of relativism with the biblical objectivity philosophy. So first, let's look at relativism, and that's a pretty big one we'll be looking at for a while. It says that reality, knowledge, and/or morality are subjective. So if you think about it, this literally lies as a philosophy because it's a rejection of absolute truth. And then within this, you have eisegesis, which is where the reader is inserting their subjective meaning into the text. So, like reinterpreting Genesis 1 to 11 as being myth to coincide the evolutionary timeline. Or, like in schools nowadays, when they say, now kids, what does a story mean to you? Well, I don't care what it means to you, because that's not why most people write about anything. It's not why people write about fact. It's not why most people write fiction. And it's probably not what you mean to do when you text somebody. Like, especially when you text somebody, hey, I'll be there at 5 o'clock. The intent is not for them to reinterpret it to mean something like, oh, he's saying he's going to be bringing cake and pie at 4:37. I don't think so. You'll be sadly disappointed then. And then there is factual relativism. Says that truth is subjective. So all of this, well, that's your truth, this is my truth kind of stuff. Well, sorry, you don't get to have your own truth because that violates the law of non-contradiction. And I know, surprising. It is still a thing. And then finally, there is moral/ethical relativism, which says that morality is subjective. But then, if that's true, then you can't say that Hitler was wrong, period. You have to give some sort of caveat, give some sort of caveat, which I bet no one wants to do. Now we'll look at some forms of factual relativism, because there are many. They include idealism, which says that only the conscious mind definitely exists. So it's that kind of, well, if we're living in the Matrix kind of thinking. The problem is, though, it's set up to be unprovable, because if it's true, how would you know and how would you prove it? You'd have to go outside of reality for that. Then there is phenomenalism. It's kind of weird. It says that objects themselves don't truly exist, just the perceptions of them. So it's like saying that the apple itself doesn't exist, but you seeing the apple and you seeing its color, that does exist. Or think about the saying, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound. You see, it starts from the premise that sound might only exist as long as it's heard, as long as it's perceived. You gotta hear it for the sound to exist. The problem is, though, you can't perceive phenomenalism. So how could you know that that's true? And therefore it wouldn't be true, because you can't perceive it, and only perceptions exist. Again, with the law of non-contradiction. And then finally there is instrumentalism, which says that ideas are only worth their effectiveness at predicting, not their factuality. This is usually mostly just applied to science, but it doesn't apply to itself. Instrumentalism is not an effective predicting tool, so what's the worth of it? And let's also look at some forms of moral slash ethical relativism. They include cultural slash historical relativism, which says that morality is based on the consensus of a culture or timeline. The problem is, though, if that's true, then you can't say that history or cultures are wrong. You can't say that a culture that commits cannibalism is wrong because that's their ethics. And you can't say that slavery was bad in the past, or racism in general was bad in the past, because that was the morality of the day. Oh, wait, no one really believes that. If you do, then what the heck? Then there is subjectivism, which says that morality is based on everyone's own individual opinion. So it's like saying, well, everyone should just be able to do whatever they want. Well, no one actually believes that, or at least most don't actually believe that. Because if it were so, then you cannot call anything anyone else does or believes or whatever wrong, and therefore a society cannot make laws. Because according to my morality, it's not illegal for me to steal this guy's wallet. Yeah, that sort of thinking. And then most moral relativism takes the form of consequentialism, where morality is based on the outcome, i.e., the ends justify the means philosophy. The problem is, though, you gotta think then, what is a good outcome? What makes an outcome good? Because of the input action, or whatever, if its morality is totally subjective, then how do you get an outcome with an objective morality, and where do you get it from? Where do you get the moral status from? And let's look at some forms of consequentialism. Like I said, relativism is a pretty big one. Don't worry, we're just about done looking at it. Forms include egoism, which says that morality is based on one's fulfillment of their self-interest. So then this is literally just self-idolatry as a philosophy. It's arrogancy, well, it's arrogance and haughtiness and pride all as a philosophy. And then there is utilitarianism/hedonism, which says that morality is based on the amount of pleasure something creates and the amount of pain that it does not, because it says that that's the purpose of existence, is pleasure. Existence is all about pleasure, and that's the perspective of this sort of morality. The problem, though, is you gotta think, what happens if someone finds their own pain or someone else's pain is pleasurable? Then the two are no longer inverses, but parallels. So what do you do from there? Got a problem. And finally, there is pragmatism, which says that morality is based on practicality. But the problem with this, like with most forms of relativism, especially moral relativism, is that it doesn't apply to the standard. You can't base the morality of practicality on the morality of practicality. You can't. It's this sort of circular reasoning, this assumed dart. So then why would, so then you gotta think, well, then why is practicality the standard in the first place if it doesn't apply to itself? Now let's contrast all that we've looked at, which I know it's a lot, with objectivity philosophy. It says that reality and its aspects are objective absolutes. In other words, there is truth, basically. And this must be so because John 14:6 says, quote, Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So if Jesus, who is God, and therefore exists, is truth itself, therefore truth must exist as well. And therefore reality and its aspects are objective absolutes. And within this you have eisegesis, where instead of the reader inserting their meaning into the text, it's trying to take out the author's meaning of the text. Find what the author is really trying to say. And this is implied in 2 Timothy 2, the third part of 15. It says, rightly handling the word of truth. Now, does that sound like injecting your own meaning into the text or finding the author's meaning? Just saying. And then there is realism, which says what is no matter what, whether you perceive it or believe it to be so or not. And this is expressed all throughout Scripture, even from the first verse. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Period. Fact. And even just looking at Genesis chapter 1, so many times in it says, and God said, and it was so. And think about all the things that were created before mankind was. You got the first 5 days of creation and all the creatures before man on day 6. And then finally, there is Christian ethics, which says that actions, beliefs, and emotions, and this includes their context. It's not that it's subjective and changes with context, the context is part of it. Like motive and so many other, and like motive, intent, and so many other things. And it says that all of these have a constant moral status. So like something with its context in mind is either always immoral, always moral, or always amoral, meaning neither of the two. And this must be so because we look at the second part of Mark 10:18 says, no, God himself said, no one is good except God alone. So God is the standard of goodness and therefore all of morality. And then the first part of Malachi 3:6 says, for I, the Lord, do not change. So therefore the standard of morality never changes. So everything's moral status is constant, which then must include its context for that to be so. And let's pick Christian ethics apart a little. Within it, you have moral absolutism, which says that everything's moral status is constant, as said, and intrinsic, like we see in the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20:15 says, you shall not steal, period. And then there's moral universalism, which says that every time period and culture must follow the moral law. You see, Romans 2:15 says, quote, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. You see, as established earlier, the moral law, the standard of morality, is always constant. And Romans 2:15 tells us that everybody knows it across time, period, and culture. So therefore, everybody's got to follow it. And then finally, there's altruism, which says to prioritize others, like it says in Philippians 2:3. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. But obviously, this doesn't apply to me. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, neither does moral universalism. Again, just kidding.